My truck's engine clicked as it cooled in the sharp mountain air. The tiny sounds strangely loud in the heavy quiet around the cabin. 6 hours on the road from Denver had finally brought me to this so-called research station, though it resembled a long-abandoned hunting lodge far more than any scientific outpost. The job description hadn't offered much clarity. Basic caretaker tasks, checking weather instruments, decent pay for someone willing to live alone. After 3 months without work and my savings dwindling to almost nothing, I was desperate enough to take it. The cabin sat in a small clearing carved out of thick pines, jagged peaks jutting up in every direction like broken stone teeth. No power lines, no nearby houses, no people, just wilderness, and whatever creatures wandered through it. Honestly, that was exactly what I wanted. I didn't need anyone poking into my past or offering pity I didn't ask for. Hoisting my duffel from the passenger seat, I headed toward the front door, pine needles crackling under my boots with every step. I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat and walked toward the front door, boots crunching on pine needles and dried leaves. The porch sagged slightly under my weight, and I made a mental note to check the structural integrity before winter set in. Mountain weather could be brutal, and the last thing I wanted was to end up trapped under a collapsed roof. Something white caught my attention as I reached for the door handle, an envelope wedged tight behind the doorframe like someone had shoved it there in a hurry. I worked it loose and turned it over in my hands. No postmark, no address, just my name written in careful block letters across the front. Inside, I found a single sheet of paper covered in the same precise handwriting. The letter started without preamble. James, you need to follow these rules exactly if you want to survive your time here. I know how this sounds, but every word is true. Don't make the same mistakes others have made. Rule 1. If you see a child in the yard, especially a girl, in a blue dress, do not approach her. Do not speak to her. Get in your truck and drive away immediately. Don't come back until the next day. Rule 2. Voices will call to you from the forest. They might sound like family members or friends asking for help. Never respond. Never go looking for them. Stay inside and wait for the voices to stop. Rule 3. Never go outside at night, unless the porch light is working. If it burns out or won't turn on, stay inside, no matter what you hear. Rule 4. Footsteps in the attic always start at 2 a.m. Do not investigate. Do not goop there. The sounds will stop on their own. Rule 5. You'll see a man standing in the trees with red eyes. Don't look directly at him. Don't acknowledge him. Close the curtains and wait for him. Totally vague. These aren't suggestions. Your life depends on following them exactly. Good luck, David. I read through the letter twice, then laughed out loud. The sound carried across the clearing and bounced back from the tree line, startling a few birds into flight. Classic hazy. Every remote job had someone trying to spook the new guy with local legends and ghost stories. David, whoever he was, had put serious effort into this one. The rules were specific enough to seem genuine while being completely ridiculous. A girl in a blue dress, voices from the forest, red-eyed men in trees. It read like a bad horror movie script. I folded the letter and headed inside, leaving the door open behind me to let in fresh air. The cabin's interior was basic, but a kitchen with outdated appliances took up one corner, while a stone fireplace dominated the opposite wall. 2 doors led to what I assumed were bedrooms, and a pull-down ladder near the back provided access to the attic. Everything looked clean and well-maintained, which surprised me. Most remote stations I'd worked showed signs of neglect. My equipment cases sat in the truck bed, waiting to be hauled inside. Weather monitoring gear, mostly digital sensors, data loggers, communication equipment to transmit readings back to the main office. The work would be straightforward. Check the instruments twice daily, record environmental data, maintain the equipment, and file reports every week. Easy money for someone who didn't mind isolation. I spent the next hour bringing everything inside and setting up my workspace in the main room. The communication equipment worked out perfectly, connecting to the satellite uplink without any issues. The weather sensors would need to be tomorrow, but I could handle the initial programming tonight. The letter sat on the kitchen counter where I dropped it, catching my eye every time I walked past. David's handwriting looked steady and deliberate, not like someone playing a prank. But then again, commitment to the bit was what made these things work. He'd probably spent weeks crafting the perfect haunted mountain story to mess with whoever replaced him. As the afternoon wore on, I explored the rest of the cabin. The larger bedroom had a decent bed and dresser, while the smaller one was empty, except for a desk and chair. Both had windows facing different directions, giving me views of the surrounding forest. The bathroom was tiny, but had hot water, which was more than I'd expected at this elevation. The attic ladder creaked when I tested it, but held my weight without issue. I climbed up and poked my head through the opening, using my phone's flashlight to look around. Nothing but empty floorboards and exposed rafters. No mysterious footsteps up there, just dust and spider webs. By evening, I had my equipment running, and my gear unpacked. The cabin felt comfortable enough with good insulation and a solid roof. He built a fire in the stone fireplace and settled into the worn couch with a book, listening to the wind move through threepennies outside. David's letter still sat on the counter, visible from where I relaxed. The guy had done his homework on local folklore. I'd give him that. Mountain regions always had stories about strange sightings and unexplained disappearances. Mix in some isolation and imagination, and people could convince themselves of anything. I thought about my mother back in Phoenix, probably watching her evening shows and wondering how I was settling in. She'd worry if she knew how remote this place was, but the distance felt good right now. No one here knew about me previous job, the circumstances that led to my firing, or the months after rejection letters that followed. Just me, the mountains, and the equipment that needed babysitting. The fire crackled off logs, settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, night had fallen, completely, turning the windows into black mirrors that reflected the warm interior light. I'd need to set up the exterior sensors tomorrow, and establish my daily routine. The work would keep me busy enough to avoid overthinking David's elaborate joke. I glanced at the letter one more time, then turned my attention back to my book, dismissing any thoughts of Booth's strange warning. My hiking boots found their rhythm on the mountain trail as I made my way toward the first weather station. The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine resin and damp earth, and I felt more optimistic about this job than I had about anything in months. 2 miles of moderate hiking through familiar terrain. This was exactly the kind of work I could handle. No office politics, no pointless meetings, just me and instruments that needed basic maintenance. The first monitoring station sat in a small clearing about a 4 mile from the cabin. I pulled out my tablet and began recording the over. From the temperature and humidity sensors, everything looked normal, well within expected ranges for this elevation and season. The solar panels were clean. The data logger showed steady transmission to the main office, and the equipment housing showed no signs of weather damage. I continued deeper into the forest, following GPS coordinates to locate the remaining stations. The work proved straightforward. Checking batter levels, clearing debris from instrument housings, recording measurements, and noting any maintenance needs. Each station took about 15 minutes to service properly. The routine felt good after months of uncertainty and rejection. Letters, I could do this job well, and the isolation meant nobody would be around to judge my previous employment situation. The third station required replacing a temperature probe that had given inconsistent readings for the past week. I'd brought spare parts in my backpack, and the repair took longer than expected. By the time I finished documenting everything and started hiking back toward the cabin, the sun had climbed well above the tree line. My stomach was starting to complain about missing breakfast when the cabin came into view through the trees. I was already thinking about what to make for lunch when I saw her. A small figure stood perfectly still in the front yard, maybe 20 feet from the cabin's porch. A girl around 7 years old, wearing what looked like a faded blue dress. She faced directly toward me, not moving at all, no fidgeting, no curious head tilts. Just complete stillness that seemed wrong for a child her age. My steps slowed as David's letter came rushing back. Rule number 1. A girl in a blue dress. Do not approach her. Do not speak to her. Get in your truck and drive away immediately. The memory hit me like cold water. I stopped walking and studied the child more carefully. Her skin looked unnaturally pale, almost gray in the filtered sunlight. And her eyes, they seemed too large for her face, completely black without any visible whites. She didn't blink, didn't move, just watched me with that unnatural stillness. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some neighbor's kid who'd wandered up the mountain. There weren't any neighbors for miles, and no way a 7-year-old could have hiked this far alone. The nearest town was over an hour's drive on winding mountain roads. The girl continued staring at me, and I felt something crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Every instinct told me to call out, ask if she was lost, try to help. But David's words repeated in my head, your life depends on following them. Exactly. I took a step backward, then another. The girl didn't react to my movement, didn't track me with her eyes or turn her head. She just kept staring at the spot where I'd been standing, like she was looking through me at something else entirely. My truck sat parked next to the cabin, keys in my pocket. I needed to get there without getting closer to the girl. I continued backing away slowly, then began making a wide circle around the clearing to approach the vehicle from the side. Every few steps, I glanced back at her. She hadn't moved, hadn't even shifted her weight. When I reached the truck, my hands shook as I fumbled for the keys. The girl remained motionless in the yard, still facing the spot where I had first emerged from the forest. I started the engine and began backing down the dirt access road, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror. The girl grew smaller in the reflection as I gained distance, but she never moved, never turned to watch me leave, just stood there like a statue in a faded blue dress. I was about a 4-mile down the mountain road when something changed in the mirror. The girl's form seemed to waver, like heat distortion rising from summer pavement. Then she began to stretch upward, her small frame elongating in ways that defied every law of physics. Her arms multiplied, sprouting from her torso in impossible directions. What had been a 7-year-old child twisted into something with too many limbs, all reaching and grasping at empty air. I pressed harder on the accelerator and forced myself to look away from the mirror. When I checked again 30 seconds later, the yard was empty. My heart hammered against my ribs as I navigated the winding mountain road. Every turn brought the possibility of seeing that thing, whatever it really was, standing in the road ahead. I checked the mirrors obsessively, expecting to see it following me somehow, but the road behind remained empty. The nearest gas station sat at the junction where the mountain road met the main highway about 20 meters from the cabin. I pulled into the parking lot and sat in my truck for 10 minutes trying to what I'd witnessed. The logical part of my mind offered explanations. Altitude sickness, dehydration, stress from the job change. But I'd seen that thing transform with perfect clarity. No hallucination could have been that detailed. That specific dot. I went inside and bought coffee and a sandwich, then returned to my truck. The idea of driving back up the mountain before dark felt impossible. Whatever that thing was, David's rules existed for a reason. I'd follow them exactly, which meant staying away until the next day. I spent the night in my truck in the gas station parking lot, dozing fitfully between checking the time on my phone. Every noise made me alert. Cars pulling in for fuel, the attendant tempting trash cans, the rumble of passing semis, but nothing. Approached my vehicle, and nothing resembled a small girl in a blue dress. The sun was well up when I finally drove back to the cabin the next morning. I parked in the same spot and approached the front yard, cautiously, scanning for any sign of the girl. The yard looked normal in the bright daylight, just pine needles, scattered leaves, and patches of exposed dirt. But where the girl had stood, deep gouges marked the earth, not footprints, but long scratches like something with claws had been scraping at the ground. The marks were fresh, cutting through the surface dirt to expose darker soil underneath. I counted at least 6 different scratch patterns, all concentrated in the exact spot where I'd seen her standing. I walked carefully around the gouges without getting too close. Whatever had made these marks possessed strength beyond what a 7-year-old should have. The scratches were deep enough that I could have laid my finger in them. Back inside the cabin, I went straight to the kitchen counter where I'd left David's letter. I unfolded it and read through every word again this time, paying attention to details I'd dismissed as creative writing. The precise language, the specific warnings, the emphasis on exact compliance. These weren't suggestions based on local folklore. They were survival instructions written by someone who'd encountered these things firsthand and lived to warn others. David hadn't been trying to scare me with elaborate pranks. He'd been trying to keep me alive. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my shirt pocket close to my chest, where I wouldn't forget it was there. Outside, the gouged earth served as physical proof that everything David had written was real. The girl in the blue dress existed along with whatever supernatural force allowed her to transform into something with claws and too many limbs. 4 more rules remained on David's list. If the first one had been this accurate, the others would be just as real. Voices from the force that sounded like family members. A man with red eyes standing among the trees. Footsteps in the attic at 2 in the morning. I looked up at the ceiling, noting the exact position of the attic access ladder. Tonight, I'd find out how real those footsteps were. The axe bit deep into the pine log, splitting it cleanly down the middle. I'd been working behind the cabin for about an hour, building up my winter firewood supply while the afternoon weather held. The routine felt good. Something normal and productive after yesterday's encounter with whatever that thing in the blue dress had been. My shoulders sagged from the repetitive motion, but the physical work helped keep my mind focused on practical matters. The woodpile was getting respectable when I heard my mother's voice calling from the forest. James! James! Honey! Are you? My axe froze mid-swing. The voice was perfect, her exact tone. The slight rasps she'd developed from years of smoking. Even the way she drew out the second syllable of my name when she was worried. But my mother lived 800 miles away in Phoenix, probably getting ready for her afternoon game shows about now. James, please, I'm lost. I need you to help me find my way back. The voice came from deeper in the trees, maybe 100 yards into the forest. My hands tightened on the axe handle as David's rules came flooding back. Rule number 2. Voices will call to you from the forest. They might sound like family members, or friends asking for help. Never respond. Never go looking for them. James, I can hear you out there. Why won't you answer me? I'm scared. Every instinct I had screamed at me to call back, to drop the axe, and run toward that voice. My mother had never been to Colorado, had no way of reaching this place. But the desperation in her tone sounded completely real. She was bleeding now, her voice breaking like she was crying. Please, honey, it's getting dark and I can't find the path. I just need you to call out so I can follow your voice. I forced myself to lower the axe and walk slowly toward the cabin's back door. My legs felt unsteady, like I was fighting against my own body's desire to rush into the forest. The voice followed me, growing more frantic. James, don't leave me out here alone. I reached the door and fumbled with their handle, my hand shaking badly enough that it took 3 tries to turn it. Once inside, I threw the deadbolt and pressed my back against the door. The voice continued calling, moving around the cabin now like someone circling the building. I know you're in there. Why are you hiding from me? I raised you better than this. That last part hit hard. The disappointment in her tone. The guilt trip. Phrasing it was exactly what Min mother would say if I actually ignored her cries for help. But I knew she was safe in her Phoenix apartment, probably making herself a sandwich and getting ready to watch her stories on television. I moved to the kitchen counter where my equipment tablet was charging and tried to focus on recording the afternoon's weather readings. My fingers kept slipping on the screen as I entered numbers, and I had to delete and retype the temperature data twice. The voice outside grew more desperate. James, something's following me. I can hear it in the bushes. Please help me. He gripped the tablet tighter and forced myself to concentrate on the humidity measurements. Numbers, facts, data. That made sense and followed logical patterns. The voice was not my mother. My mother was safe in Arizona, not wandering around a Colorado mountain forest. Fine. If you won't help me, I'll find my own way. But don't come crying to me when you need something. The last comment was delivered in my mother's exact angry tone. The same one she'd used when I was 12 and refused to help her carry groceries. Whoever or whatever was out there had studied her speech patterns, her emotional triggers, but it wasn't her. I watched the clock on the tablet as the voice continued for another 15 minutes, alternating between pleas for help and accusations about my selfishness. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The force went quiet except for the normal sounds of wind moving through pine branches. I waited another hour before unlocking the door and checking outside. The woodpile sat where I'd left it, split log around the chopping block. My axe lay in the dirt where I dropped it. No footprints marked the soft earth around the cabin. No signs that anyone had actually been circling the building, but I could still hear that perfect reproduction of my mother's voice echoing in my head. The rest of the day passed normally. I finished my equipment checks, made dinner, and built a fire in the fireplace as evening settled over the mountains. I tried calling my mother around 8 o'clock using the satellite phone to reach her landline in Phoenix. Hello, honey. Her voice sounded exactly like the one from the forest, which made my stomach twist. How's the new job going? It's good, Ma. Quiet. Just wanted to check in. That's sweet of you. I was just thinking about you today. Had this weird feeling like you might be in some kind of trouble. I nearly dropped out the phone. What kind of feeling? Oh, you know how mothers worry? Probably nothing, just seemed like you might need help with something. We talked for another 10 minutes about the neighbors and the Phoenix weather, but her earlier comments stuck with me long after I hung up. Some kind of connection had existed between the voice in the forest and my actual mother. Like whatever was out there had been tugging on the emotional bond between us. I went to bed around 11 o'clock, but sleep took a long time to come. Every small sound from outside made me alert. Branches cracking, wind patterns changing, the distant call of an owl. When I finally dozed off, I kept one ear open for any voices that might start calling again. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, heavy footsteps began pacing back and forth in the attic directly above my bedroom. It jolted awake as the first footfall echoed through the ceiling. The steps were deliberate and rhythmic, like someone searching methodically through the space above me. Not random creaks or settling noises. but the unmistakable sound of weight moving across floorboards. Another step, then another. The pattern, repeated every few seconds as whatever was up there walked from one end of the attic to the other. I lay frozen in bed, counting each footfall and watching tiny particles of dust drift down from the ceiling in the moonlight streaming through a bedroom window. Rule number 4 echoed in my memory. Footsteps in the attic always start at 2 a.m. Do not investigate. Do not goop there. The sounds will stop on their own. The steps continued their steady pattern for what felt like hours. I checked my phone repeatedly. 215, 222,238. The sound never varied in rhythm or intensity. Just that same deliberate pacing, like someone looking for something specific and checking every corner of the attic space. More dust filtered down as the footsteps passed directly overhead. I found myself holding my breath during each pass, then exhaling slowly when the sounds moved to the far end of the attic. The temptation to grab a flashlight and climb up there was overwhelming. Whatever was making those sounds was in me space, in my cabin, and every instinct told me to confront it. But David's rules had been right about Dagger in the blue dress, and the voices in the forest. If he said not to investigate the attic, then I'd stay exactly where I was. By 2:45 the steady rhythm was making me feel hypnotized. The same pattern over and over with dust motes dancing in the moonbeams. Each time a footsteps passed overhead, I started counting 1, 2, 3, 4 steps across. Then a pause, then a return journey. 15 seconds each way. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, the footsteps stopped. The silence felt heavier than the noise had been. I waited another hour before relaxing enough to close my eyes again. And when I finally fell asleep, I dreamed about my mother calling for help, while something with too many feet paced endlessly through empty rooms above her head. The next evening, I was reading by the living room window when a movement in the trees caught my attention. I looked up from my book to see a tall figure standing among the pine trees, about 50 yards away from the cabin. The man was motionless, just like the girl had been. But where she'd been, small and pale. This figure towered above the surrounding undergrowth, and his eyes, 2 points of red light that cut through the evening darkness like searchlights, fixed directly on my window. Immediately you looked down at my book, remembering rule number 5. Don't look directly at him. Don't acknowledge him. Close the curtains, and wait for him to leave. My hands shook as I stood up and walked to the window. The red glow was visible, in my peripheral vision, those twin points of light tracking my movement. I grabbed the curtain edge and pulled it closed, blocking my view of the forest completely. Then I sat back down and tried to continue reading, though the words blurred together on the page. The book was about weather patterns in mountain regions, technical and boring enough that I'd hoped it would help me relax. Instead, I kept reading the same paragraph over and over while my mind focused on what was standing outside. Minutes crawled by. I checked my phone obsessively. 7:30, 7:45, 810. The curtain remained closed, but I could feel those red eyes out there watching the cabin, waiting for me to look back, to make eye contact to acknowledge what I'd seen. At 8:20, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A low sound almost below the range of human hearing, like a massive engine, idling in the distance. It seemed to come from the direction where Thefagure was standing, a deep rumble that I felt more than heard. The sound continued for several minutes, then faded away. I forced myself to wait another hour before checking the window again. When I finally pulled back the curtain, the forest looked empty. No tall figure, no red eyes, cutting through its darkness. But something was wrong with the trees where he'd been standing. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the front porch, shining the beam toward the spot where I'd seen the figure. A cluster of pine trees that had been green and healthy yesterday now stood completely dead. Their needles had turned brown and fallen away, leaving bare branches that looked like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. T-bark had turned black and cracked, as if something had sucked all the life out of them in a matter of hours. I kept their flashlight beam moving, not wanting to focus on any one spot too long and could see those red eyes were still out there somewhere. But the dead trees were unmistakable. 5 mature pines that had been killed by whatever force that figure carried with him. Back inside, I made sure all the curtains were closed and every door was locked. 3 of David's 5 rules had now proven themselves real. The girl in the blue dress. The voices from Thefris that sounded like people I knew. The footsteps in the attic at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. The red-eyed man standing among the trees. Only rule 3 remained untested. Never go outside at night unless the porch light was working. I walked to the front door and flipped the switch, watching Thippish light illuminate the wooden boards outside. It worked fine, casting a warm yellow glow across the front yard. But looking at those dead trees in the distance, I had no intention of testing whether the light would keep working when I needed it most. I was making my rounds to check the evening equipment readings when I heard the generator coughing behind the cabin. The sound wasn't right. A stuttering rhythm. That meant fuel, flow problems, or worse. I'd been putting off a thorough inspection for 2 days, but the equipment couldn't afford to lose power overnight. The porch light cast its familiar yellow glow across the front yard as I walked around to the generator housing. I'd grown to appreciate that light more than I'd ever thought possible. Such a simple thing. But after seeing what David's rules protected against, it checked it obsessively every evening. I was pulling off the generator's access panel when the light clicked off by. The darkness hit like a physical weight. No moon tonight, just thick clouds that blocked even the faintest starlight. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight and illuminated the generator's interior, but my hands were already shaking. Rule 3 echoed in my head with perfect clarity. Never go outside at night unless the porch light is working. If it burns out or won't turn on, stay inside no matter what you hear. But the generator was on its last legs. The fuel filter looked clogged, and the carburetor was making grinding noises that meant serious internal problems. If this thing died completely, I'd lose all my monitoring equipment. The satellite uplink, the data transmission, everything that connected to the outside world would go dark. I walked quickly to the front door and tested the porch light switch. Nothing. I tried it several more times, but the bulb stayed dark. The generator was still running, so the electrical problem was isolated to the light circuit. Probably a blown bulb or loose connection. My equipment cases sat inside the cabin, including spare bulbs and basic electrical tools. I could replace the bulb and restore the lighting 5 minutes, but that meant going back outside afterward to finish the generator repairs, and by then, it might be too late. The engine was making worse noises with each passing minute. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, weighing my options. David's rules had saved my life 3 times already, but had been written by someone who didn't depend on this equipment for his livelihood. If the generator died, I'd lose my job and end up back where I started, unemployed and running out of. Sabin's the carburetor made a particularly awful grating sound, and I made my decision. I grabbed my phone for light and headed back to the generator housing. More crashes followed, each one louder than the last. It sounded like a demolition crew was working in the attic, systematically destroying everything up there. The ceiling fixtures weighed with each impact, and hairline cracks spread across the plaster like spider webs. I pulled the blanket over me head and tried to block out the noise, but the attacks continued for hours. Whatever was in the attic was running out of patience, and the peaceful footsteps of previous nights had turned into an allowed assault on the cabin structure. When morning finally came, the ceiling above my bed looked like it might collapse at any moment. I spent the day moving my most essential equipment to the truck and working on temporary ceiling supports using lumber for my supplies. The damage from the previous night's attic assault looked worse in daylight. Long cracks spreading across the plaster like fractured ice, chunks of drywall hanging loose, and the ceiling fixture barely holding on by its electrical wires. Whatever was up there had been trying to break through, and I doubted the structure would survive another night of that violence. The 5th night arrived with an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. No wind stirred the pine branches. No normal forest sounds echoed from the darkness. Even the usual creaking of Thecabin's wooden frame had gone silent, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I was checking the porch light for the 3rd time when I saw her standing in the yard. The girl in the blue dress had returned, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible between the trees, the readied silhouette watched from the forest edge. His crimson gaze cut through the darkness like twin laser beams fixed on the cabin windows. The child remained motionless in her usual spot, but something was different about her stance tonight. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her 2 large black eyes reflected the porch light with a noily sheen. I backed away from the window and closed the curtains, my hand shaking as I secured the fabric. Rule 1 and Rule 5 were being tested simultaneously. Don't look at the child. Don't acknowledge the readied man. But having both entities present felt like a coordinated attack, rather than random supernatural activity. The voices started before I could retreat to the bedroom. James, we need your help. My father's voice called from the forest, even though he'd been dead for 5 years. Your mother is trapped up here in the mountains. She's hurt and can't walk. Son, please come find us. That was my grandfather's voice, dead for 15 years, but speaking with the same gentle authority I remembered from childhood. We've been waiting for you to help us get home. More voices joined in. My aunt Sarah, my high school friend Mike, my college roommate Danny, all of them called my name. all of them claiming to be lost or injured and needing my assistance. The voices came from every direction around the cabin, creating a chorus of familiar people who should have been impossible to hear. I pressed my back against the kitchen wall and tried to block out the sound, but the voices groomed or insistent. They were saying things only the real people would have known. Childhood memories, private conversations, inside jokes that no supernatural entity should have been able to access. Yet, I knew they were all lies designed to make me break rule. 2. Above my head, the attic exploded into violence. The attic access door began rattling. The wooden panel in the hallway ceiling shook violently in its frame, like something was trying to push it open from above. The metal hinges groaned under the strain, and dust cascaded down with each impact. Whatever was up there had abandoned any pretense of stealth and was now actively trying to break through into the main cabin. The voices outside grew more frantic. The child remained motionless in the yard. The redded man's gaze burned the curtains, and the attic access door rattled harder with each passing second. All 5 supernatural forces were working together in a coordinated assault designed to terrorize me into breaking the rules. The access door's hinges snapped. The wooden panel crashed to the hallway floor, and the pull-down ladder unfolded with a metallic screech. Darkness yawned above the opening, like an open mouth. But I could hear movement up there. Something large shifting around among whatever David and the other caretaker shard left behind. I had 2 choices. Wait for whatever was in the attic to come down and confront me in the cabin, or take control of the situation and go up there myself. Neither option followed David's rules, but the rules assumed the entities would maintain their usual patterns. Tonight was different. Tonight, they were breaking their own established behaviors to force a confrontation. I grabbed my flashlight and headed forth ladder. The rungs creaked under my weight as I climbed into the attic space. My flashlight beam swept across the area, revealing something I hadn't expected. The space was filled with belongings from previous caretakers. Cardboard boxes lined the walls. Plastic storage containers sat stacked in corners, and personal items were scattered across the floor like someone had been searching through them. I moved deeper into the attic, stepping carefully around the debris. Most of the boxes contained clothes and books, but others held more interesting items. Photo albums showing different people at the cabin over the years. Personal journals bound in worn leather. Equipment manuals for weather monitoring gear that looked decades old. I opened the nearest journal and found entries dated from 1987. The handwriting belonged to someone named Robert Chun, who documented these supernatural encounters I'd been experiencing. The girl in the blue dress calling from the forest. Footsteps in the attic at 2 a.m. The red-eyed man standing among the trees. Another journal from 1994 belonged to Sarah Martinez. Her entries described identical experiences with slightly different variations. The voices had sometimes sounded like her sister instead of her mother, and the attic footsteps had been accompanied by scratching sounds, but the basic pattern was the same, right down to the specific times and locations. I found journals from 2001, 2008, 2015, and several other years. Each caretaker had faced the same supernatural forces, and each had documented their experiences in careful detail. But something was wrong with them. Some journals ended abruptly mid-entry. Others had final pages that had been torn out, and a few showed signs of water damage or fire. The most recent journal was different from the others. The handwriting was familiar, the same block letters as the warning letter I'd been carrying in my shirt pocket. This was David's journal, and it contained information the others didn't have. I opened to the final entry, dated just 3 months ago. Day 28. I figured out what they are and why they're trapped here. Some kind of accident or ritual went wrong decades ago, binding them to this specific location. They can't leave the mountain on their own, but they can possess anyone who breaks the rules. Once they have a human host, they can use that person's body to escape. I've been talking to them through the attic access. They're getting desperate. Each caretaker who follows the rules completely stays safe, but anyone who breaks even one rule disappears forever. I think they're using the missing people's bodies to try different escape methods. The entities keep offering deals. They promised to let me live if I helped them leave the mountain. But I've seen what happened to the others who agreed. Their bodies become empty shells, while something else moves around inside. I'm leaving tonight. I've read instructions for the next caretaker, but I doubt they'll listen. No one ever believes the warnings until it's too late. If whoever finds this journal is smart, they'll burn this place down and walk away. Don't try to help the entities. Don't try to understand them. Just run. Laughter echoed from below me. A child's giggle drifted up through the attic access opening. clear and musical and completely wrong. The girl had gotten inside the cabin while I was reading David's journal. She was directly below him now, standing in the hallway where the ladder led down. I crept to the access opening and peered down carefully. The hallway looked empty, but the laughter continued closer now. Lex was moving through the cabin's main room. I could hear her bare feet patting against the wooden floor as she explored space I'd thought was secure. More sounds joined hers. Heavy footsteps that belonged to something much larger than a 7-year-old girl. The Redded man had entered the cabin as well, and the voices from outside were growing louder as additional entities gathered around the building. I had to get down there. Whatever was happening in my cabin, I couldn't face it from the attic. I stuffed David's journal into my jacket pocket and moved toward the ladder, but stopped when I heard my mother's voice, speaking directly below the opening. "James, honey, we've been waiting for you to join us." I looked down and saw them all gathered in the hallway. The girl in the blue dress stood directly beneath the ladder. Her pale face turned upward toward me. Her black eyes reflected my flashlight beam like mirrors, and her smile showed too many teeth arranged in rows like a shark's mouth. Behind her, the Redded man's tall form filled the narrow hallway. His eyes blazed with that familiar crimson light, but now I could see his face clearly. The features were human, but wrong, as if someone had tried to build a person from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. His mouth was too wide, his nose too narrow, and his skin had the waxy texture of something that had never been truly alive. Shadowy figures pressed against the walls, vague human shapes that represented the voices I'd been hearing. They shifted and flowed like smoke, but I could make out familiar facial features in their dark forms. My father's jawline, my grandfather's gentle eyes, my Aunt Sarah's curly hair. They were wearing the faces of my dead relatives like masks. "Come down, James." The girl's voice was sweet and innocent, but it came from that mouth full of predator teeth. "Woo in to make you an offer. We can help each other," the Redded man said. His voice was deep and resonant, like sound echoing from the bottom of a well. "You help us leave this mountain, and we let you walk away unharmed. All you have to do is break one little rule," added the shadow, wearing my father's face. "Just one. Step outside without the porch light working. Acknowledge our presence. Followed the child into the forest. It's so simple. We've been trapped here for so long," whispered the girl. "We just want to go home. Don't you want to go home, too?" They waited for my response, all of them looking up at me with eyes that weren't quite human. The offer was tempting in its simplicity. Help them escape and they'd leave me alone. But David's journal had made it clear what would happen to anyone who agreed to their deal. "No," I said. "I'm not helping you." The girl's smile vanished instantly. Her face twisted with rage, and when she opened her mouth, a sound like breaking glass emerged. The Redded man's eyes blazed brighter, and the shadow figures began moving faster, their forms becoming more solid and defined. "Wrong answer," the girl hissed. They attacked all at once. The girl launched herself at the ladder with inhuman speed, her small hands grabbing rungs and pulling her upward like a spider. The Redded man reached up with arms that stretched impossibly long, his fingers extending toward my feet. The shadow figures flowed up the walls and across the ceiling, reaching for me from every direction. But something was wrong with their. As soon as they got close to me, they slowed down as if they were moving through a thick liquid. The girl's clawed hands stopped just inches from my legs, straining against some invisible barrier. The Redded man's extended arms couldn't quite reach the attic opening. The shadow figure is pressed against the edge of the axis, but couldn't pass through. David's rules had protected me somehow. Following them exactly had created some kind of shield that the entities couldn't break through. They could threaten and cajole and try to trick me into breaking the rules myself, but they couldn't force me to violate them. The girl screamed and dropped back to the hallway floor. The Redded man's eyes flared with such intensity that I had toe-shelled my face from the light. The shadow figures writhed and twisted, their forms becoming more chaotic. As their rage grew, then the cabin began to burn. It was a normal fire. Flames the color of fresh blood erupted from the walls and floor, spreading with supernatural speed through the building's wooden frame. The fire gave off no heat, but it consumed everything it touched, turning solid matter into ash within seconds. I scrambled back from the access opening as flames shot up through the ladder. The attic floor beneath my feet began smoldering, and I could smell the acrid scent of burning wood mixed with something else. Something organic and foul that made Mr. Mac turn. The entity's screams echoed from below as the supernatural fire spread through the cabin. They weren't trying to escape. They were feeding the flames, using their rage and frustration to fuel the destruction. If they couldn't possess me, They'd burned down everything around me and trapped me in the inferno. I crawled to the far end off the attic, where a small ventilation grate provided access to the outside. The metal was hot to the touch, but I kicked it out and squeezed through the opening onto the cabin's roof. The entire structure was now engulfed into old, strange red flames that consumed without heat. I slid down the roof slope and dropped to the ground near my truck. The keys were in my pocket. The engine started immediately, and I reversed down the dirt access road as fast as I dared in the darkness. In my rear-view mirror, the cabin looked like a torch against the night sky. But the fire wasn't spreading to the surrounding forest. It was contained somehow, burning only what the entities wanted destroyed. By the time I'd reached the main road, the flames had consumed everything. The cabin, the generator housing, even the weather monitoring equipment. All of it rode a cito ash and twisted metal. But the trees around the clearing remained untouched, and I knew the entities were still there. Still trapped, still waiting for the next caretaker who might be foolish now to break David's rules. The drive to Boulder took 4 hours through winding mountain roads, and he made it without stopping once. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. And a very few minutes. I checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see red flames or glowing eyes following me down the highway. But there was nothing behind me except empty asphalt and darkness. The Forest Service office didn't open until 8 o'clock in the morning, so I sat in their parking lot and watched the sunrise over the city. Normal people were starting their normal days, commuting to work, walking dogs, buying coffee. I'd forgotten what ordinary life looked like after 5 nights of supernatural terror. When the receptionist arrived, I was waiting by the front door, with my story prepared. Gas leak in the cabin's propane system. Explosion around midnight. I'd barely escaped with my equipment and truck. The whole structure was gone, along with all the weather monitoring gear. The duty officer, a woman named Patricia Wang, listened to my report with increasing skepticism. She pulled up satellite images on her computer and confirmed that something had indeed burned at the coordinates I'd provided. The clearing showed a blackened area where the cabin had stood, but the surrounding forest remained untouched. "That's unusual for a gas explosion," she said, studying the images. "Usually, we see more collateral damage to nearby vegetation." "Maybe the tank was smaller than I thought," I said. "I'm not an expert on propane systems." She asked for more details about the explosion, what I'd been doing when it happened, whether I'd smelled gas beforehand, if I'd heard any sounds. I stuck to my story about being outside working on the generator when the lies came easily, after what I'd actually experienced. Patricia filed an incident report and assured me that a team would investigate the site within the next few days. She also mentioned that I'd be compensated for the lost equipment. There would be an investigatio, the cause of the explosion. I signed several forms and left my contact information, then drove back to my apartment in Denver. For the first time in a week, I slept through the night without listening for footsteps or vistas. Over the following days, I couldn't stop thinking about what David's journal had revealed. The entities had been trapped on that mountain for decades, and the Forest Service had been unknowingly feeding him a steady supply of potential victims. Every few years, someone would take the caretaker job and either follow the rules to survive, or break them and disappear completely. I started researching the mountain's history, using online databases and newspaper archives. What I found made my stomach turn. These appearances went back to 1947, when the first weather monitoring station had been established. A Forest Service employee named Thomas Mitchell had vanished after 3 weeks on the job, leaving behind no trace except his abandoned truck. The official report blamed a hiking accident, though no body was ever recovered. Similar incidents occurred every few years after that. Robert Chun in 1987, the same name I'd seen in one of the attic journals. Sarah Martinez in 1994, at least 12 other people over the decades, all taking jobs as caretakers or researchers at that specific location, all vanishing without explanation. The pattern was always the same. Someone would take the isolated decision, work alone for a few weeks, then disappear entirely. Their vehicles will be found parked near the cabin, personal belongings left behind, no signs of struggle or foul play. The Forest Service would conduct searches, file reports, and eventually hear replacements. What bothered me most was how readily they kept filling the position after so many disappearances. Any reasonable organization should have questioned whether the location was safe as solo workers, but the job postings continued appearing regularly, always emphasizing the isolation and independence that would appeal to people like me. Unemployed, desperate, willing to work anywhere for decent pay. I wondered if the entities somehow influenced The hiring process drawing and exactly the type of people who would be most vulnerable to their manipulations. I spent hours online tracking down contact information for the families of missing caretakers. Most of them had given up hope years ago, but they were willing to talk about their lost relatives. What I learned confirmed my worst suspicions. 3 of the familiars mentioned that their missing person had received written warnings before starting the job. Robert Chun's sister still had copies of rules her brother had shown her, though she'd dismissed them as pranks at the time. The rules were nearly identical to David's letter, with the same 5 warnings about the girl in the blue dress, voices from Thefera staying inside at night, avoiding the attic footsteps, and not acknowledging the redded man. Sarah Martinez's mother remembered her daughter mentioning weird instructions left by the previous caretaker. Sarah had thought they were ridiculous and had thrown them away immediately. She'd lasted 6 days before disappearing. The families who'd never heard about any rules had lost their relatives within the first week of employment. Those who'd received warnings but ignored them had disappeared after 2 or 3 weeks. Only David had survived long enough to escape, and he'd done it by following every rule exactly until he could get away. I was supposed to be next in that cycle. If I hadn't found David's letter, or if it dismissed it as a joke like Sarah Martinez had done, I would have been dead within days. The entities had been waiting patiently for me to break just one rule, so they could use my body to escape their mountain prison. A week after my visit to the Forest Service office, my phone rang with an unknown number. Mr. Hodson, this is Patricia Wong from the Boulder Forest Service. I have a job opportunity that might interest you. The position was at a remote weather station in the Montana wilderness. More isolated than the previous location, better pay, and they needed someone immediately. The previous caretaker had left, and they were behind on data collection. I understand if you're hesitant after what happened in Colorado, Patricia said, but this is a different situation. Modern facilities, better communication equipment, and the area's an excellent safety record. I listened to her pitch while staring at David's, which I'd taped to my refrigerator as a constant reminder. The entities from my mountain were trapped there permanently. But what if other locations had similar problems? What if the Forest Service was unknowingly manning multiple supernatural sites, feeding victims to things that had been contained for decades? Thank you for thinking of me, I said. But I'm not interested in remote work anymore. Patricia seemed surprised by my refusal. She offered to increase the salary, mentioned excellent benefits, and emphasized how rare it was to find such isolated positions. The more she pushed, the more convinced I became that this wasn't a normal job offer. I've taken a position in Denver, I told her. Something more permanent. The next morning, I applied for a job at Morrison Hardware, a family-owned store that had been operating since the 1960s. The work was simple: helping customers find tools and supplies, operating the cash register, stocking shelves. The pay was significantly less than what the Forest Service had offered. But the store was located in the middle of town, with plenty of foot traffic and normal human interactions. The owner, an elderly man named Frank Morrison, hired me on the spot. After I demonstrated my knowledge of weather, monitoring equipment, and outdoor gear, I didn't mention my recent experiences in the mountains. Just that I'd decided to leave field research for more stability. Working at the hardware store felt like a return to sanity. Customers came in with practical problems: leaky faucets, squeaky hinges, gardens that needed fertilizer. These were issues that could be solved with the right tools and a little knowledge. No supernatural rules, no entities trying to possess human hosts, no void calling from dark forests. But I couldn't forget what I'd learned about the pattern of disappearances. David had escaped and tried to warn future caretakers by leaving his letter. But one warning wasn't enough. People would keep taking those jobs, and some would ignore the rules or never receive them at all. I made photocopies of David's original letter and researched how to distribute warnings more effectively. Anonymous emails to hiking forums, posts on websites dedicated to Forest Service employment, comments on job boards where similar positions might be advertised. I couldn't prevent people from taking dangerous jobs, but I could make sure the information was available for anyone willing to look for it. Late at night, when the hardware store was closed, and I was alone in my apartment, I sometimes thought about those entities still trapped on their mountain. The girl in the blue dress standing motionless in empty clearings. The readied man watching from between dead trees. The voices calling to no one, offering false comfort and deadly lies. They were still there, still waiting. Sooner or later, someone would take that caretaker position. Maybe they'd receive David's warnings and follow them carefully like I had. Maybe they'd dismiss them as pranks and break the rules within days. Or maybe they'd never get any warnings at all. and the entities would have a fresh victim to work with. The Forest Service would hire replacements until they found some Leonidas prey enough, or foolish enough to ignore the signs. The cycle would begin again, and those things would keep trying to escape their prison, one human host at a time. I kept David's letter in my wallet as Araminda, that some jobs aren't worth taking, no matter how good they look on paper. The mountains were full of beautiful, isolated places that seemed perfect for starting over. But some of them were hiding things that should never be set free.